Welcome, everyone, to yet another edition of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the Build Your Own Technology Radar. And we have two eminent guests, both of whom you probably recognize. We've got Neal Ford here. Neal, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. When he said we had two eminent guests, I looked up behind me to see if there were two other guests here, but I guess not. I guess it's just me and Ken. So, Neal Ford, I'm one of your regular guests. So if you've listened to our podcast, you've probably heard my voice at some point. Thanks for listening, everybody.
And also welcome Ken Mugrage.
Yeah, exactly the same thing. Also one of your regular guests and hosts. So good to speak at you again. Hopefully speak with you soon.
Wonderful. And just so that you know, I am Prem Chandrasekaran. I am also one of the regular co-hosts on this podcast. So let's get started. So this episode is about building your own radar. But before we get there, what exactly is the technology radar? And can you tell us what the radar is?
Sure. So Radar is a publication that we put out roughly twice a year. That's kind of a snapshot of different things that we're using. And so what it comes out as a website and as a downloadable PDF. And there's some basic structure to it that I'll go into at a high level so that the conversation makes more sense, but not going to get real deep into. So first off, there's a concept of rings. And the rings in the radar are they start on the outside. It's hold, which is don't do this. Assess, so hey, you should think about this. Trial, which actually means not just you should try it, but it's actually a statement of fact, meaning we are trying it. So that's something that a lot of people don't realize is that to get into that trial ring, that means that we have to be using it on production Thoughtworks projects. So a lot of people are sometimes like, hey, there's this new thing and it hasn't made it into trial yet. It's like, yeah, we're really excited about it. It's been in assess, but it's not in trial because we haven't convinced a client or the client hasn't convinced us to try it. And then the inside ring is adopt. So we used to joke around many years ago that this is if you're not doing the things in this ring, we make fun of you in the bar. And it's not quite that far, but these are the things that we think you should be adopting. Now, I do want to differentiate that. A couple months ago, Thoughtworks, we published a thing we call the sensible defaults, which is what we tell Thoughtworkers, hey, this is the default. Unless you have a reason to do something else, this is what you should be doing. This is a little bit different. And so it's not the bar is not the same, I guess is the way to say it. Adopt is if you're looking for a technique in this area, these are the ones that we have adopted that we are using. Doesn't necessarily mean they're a default, because often there will be competing technologies in adopt. So just something to pay attention to. Just because it's an adopt doesn't mean it has to be a singular, sensible default or the horrible term best practice.
Well, and a couple of nuanced things about that I'll interject just for a second before Ken goes on. Adopt doesn't mean you should use it no matter what. It means within context. So if reverse proxies show up in adopt, which they have, it doesn't mean you should go out of your way to use a reverse proxy. But if you need a reverse proxy, this is a good idea. And I want to double down again on what Ken was saying. This is a snapshot in time. And that's particularly true on that hold ring, which doesn't mean to stop doing what you're doing right this second. It means don't start anything new in that technology, because we're trying to create a perspective here. And we realize that organizations are like cruise ships. You can't turn them on a dime, but you can gradually nudge their direction. And that's the idea of hold. And almost always we try, if we put something on hold, to offer an alternative, a better alternative than the thing we're putting on hold, rather than just saying bad things about it because we don't like it.
Wonderful. Thank you both for the clarification. I had one more question about the radar. I mean, there are these quadrants. There are 4 of them, right? I mean, do they mean anything specific? How did they come about?
So they mean something, but they're to be honest with you, we're not as bothered about which quadrant something goes into. So we had the challenge of splitting the entire software development world into 4 buckets. And the buckets we chose for our radar: techniques, tools, platforms, languages, and frameworks. The truth is that often like tools is really heavy. There's just a lot of blips in there. And so it's like, well, could this be called a platform? Is this a tool? So it's important, and the quadrants are important, but they don't carry the same weight as the rings.
There's a bit of, during the meeting itself, there's a bit of parsing web pages to see if they mention the word platform or framework or something in them to give, ammunition for where it goes one versus the other. So the quadrants are not completely arbitrary, but they're not meant to be exhaustive. So it's probably worth mentioning where the quadrants came from. The origin of the radar itself came from, there was this Rebecca Parsons, when she became the CTO of Thoughtworks, she realized that there was a lot of technology stuff happening globally that she just couldn't possibly have a handle on as being a single person. So she created this advisory group called the Technology Advisory Board that met twice a year face-to-face and advised her on technology stuff. And one of the things that we always did informally was, hey, what cool stuff are you working on in your region, in Australia or China or wherever? And at some point we thought, boy, it'd be really cool if we could take that conversation and publicize it internally to let other thought workers know what kind of cool stuff other thought workers are working on. And Rebecca's assistant at the time, Darren Smith, came up with this idea of the radar visualization and actually created the first one in Keynote, because that was the only drawing tool he had on his laptop. So he used the little shape tool in Keynote to draw the first version of the radar, which we published internally. But as soon as we started publishing this thing internally, favored clients started wanting to get the insider info on that. And we thought, well, if people are interested in this, we should start publishing it for real. And that's when this idea of the technology radar was sort of born. Very shortly after we started publishing the radar, the question came up, should we allow other people to create radars? And in particular, could we use this as a way of building a sort of governance framework for clients? Because we realized how useful this thing really is, and Ken will get into the actual secret sauce of the usefulness of this thing because he just sat through one of these meetings. We realized the really kind of hidden usefulness of this, and that it would be a really useful thing for a lot of our large clients as a way of organizing their technology landscape the way we're trying to organize the industry technology landscape and sort of organize it in a way that you can consume it. We got into a really big discussion at the time. Should we try to make this a purely proprietary Thoughtworks thing and, yell at other people who try to create radars and et cetera? Or should we publicize this thing far and wide and make it open source and encourage other people to do it and trust in the fact that it'll be associated with us because we were the first ones to do it? Obviously, the second option won out. We've now created a tool that's on the Thoughtworks website to build your own technology radar that helps you either with a Google spreadsheet or with a tool you can host yourself to build your own radar. Because we realize this is actually a useful exercise in several ways for both clients and actually as individuals. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. I wrote an article probably more than a decade ago. It's on the Thoughtworks website about build your own technology radar, which is about using this as a way of kind of organizing a technology landscape.
Excellent. So thanks for the perspective on what the idea was behind, allowing other people to build their own radar, because I do remember that as soon as we published our first few radars, I think there were several other clones that came by that looked pretty similar in terms of content and even the visualization. But yeah, making it open source definitely did level up the playing field. Absolutely. So what I've gleaned from what both of you have said thus far is that one, we are not very sacrosanct about the items that appear and the positions in which they appear. So that varies and can vary and depends on context. And the other thing that you said was that the quadrants, although there is some method to that madness, again, we are pretty flexible in terms of how those quadrants can be formed. So if I'm building my own radar, we don't have to restrict ourselves to exactly those four. That's what I've been thus far, right?
So when we do this exercise for our clients, they often have, so we're trying to comment on the industry as a whole. They're trying to comment on their very specific context. And so we have an entire quadrant called languages and frameworks. Well, in most large organizations, they've chosen the primary languages they're going to be using and the primary frameworks they're going to be using. And in fact, they're not trying to have a large discussion about that, no matter how much the developers would probably like to have a larger discussion about that. But they are dealing with things like packaged software, which does not show up on our radar, but it may be a huge part of their decision process. And so that's why when we do this outside of the context of Thoughtworks Radar, that we encourage people, because if you're using it as a way of, of documenting your technology landscape, it should be accurate toward your technology landscape, not some arbitrary set of quadrants that some people created more than a decade ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, the whole idea of this is that it's available as an open source tool, isn't it? So if I want to use this myself, I can get started really, really quickly because it's available on GitHub. I can clone it. I can do a bunch of other things that I want, customize it the way that I want, and then publish it either internally or maybe even externally.
Like many things, I think it's a failure to focus just on the tool, because let's talk about what the process looks like when we do it for a client. I've hosted a bunch of these for clients. In fact, I think I did the very first one we did for one of our clients. And so what we generally recommend is to replicate as much as possible our face-to-face meeting in a slightly abbreviated way. So when I've seen this done most successfully, it's 2 full days of a group of representative technologists from the company that ideally is off-site, because if they're on-site, they're going to get distracted by mundane day job details. And if you can get them off-site, then they're less likely to be distracted about stuff. It's really important to get a cross-sectional group too, because great example is I did this exercise for one of our clients, and one of the topics that came up were containers for developer desktops. Yes, let's do development in containers. And most of the table was rah on that, but the front-end developers put a screeching halt to that because they explained how much inadvertent complexity that would add to their life if all their development had to go and be containerized prematurely. And it gave a perspective to the other people in the room. It's like, oh, well, we can't make that a universal policy. So that's the kind of thing that comes up a lot in those conversations. And so you want a mixed perspective. If you have more than like 30 people, it's hard to carry on any kind of conversation, but you can do this in multiple sessions and then aggregate the results, because as long as you have mixed groups in all of them, the results should aggregate pretty cleanly up toward one another. And generally what happens is you have a facilitator who's there, hopefully someone who's facilitated one of these before. Their primary job is just to make sure you don't get dug into weeds and talk about things too much and keep things moving along. And then you have somebody there that's copying the results of what people say. The idea is that when people come in the room, they nominate things that they want on the radar and where they want it to be. And then you go through each one of those one at a time and have a group discussion about where those things should end up. And at the end of that meeting, you end up with the radar artifact that you've created collaboratively. Now, one of the things that we have in our radar, and we also recommend that people do if they build their own, is that each blip, which is each item on the radar, has a paragraph-ish write-up. It's a paragraph for historical reasons for us, because it used to have to fit on a physical publication and it was tight. It could be a lot longer now. We just don't want to take on the writing burden. We recommend that for people who are building their own, that each of those blip write-ups almost resemble an architecture decision record. Why did we make this decision now? What is the context in the meeting, and some flesh behind it? Because one of the cool things about our visualization tool is that each blip is basically an HTML link, and you can put whatever content you want behind that link, and it can be a more fleshed out kind of document of what the thing is for.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note, is like, it'd be very easy, frankly, to, and for what it's worth, I've been a user of the radar for quite some time. This was my first time actually helping create the Thoughtworks radar. It seems like, it'd be easy to write a paragraph definition of what this thing is, but that's not helpful, right? You can find a definition anywhere. What you need is that context, and that's where, the building your own radar is, I mean, I don't know if it's quite as far as a Trojan horse, but darn close. Like Neal said that people collect these blips ahead of time and bring them to nominate. That's really where a lot of the work is, frankly. What happens is, for us at least, is a thought worker gets excited about a thing, or they see a thing on a project, or their client recommends it, or whatever, and they think it's important. So they bring it to their local advisory board member, and that they go through at that local area and figure out, okay, what are the blips we're going to take to the meeting? And then they come to the meeting and, we have a whole big discussion about it, and we'll go through some of the mechanics of that, I imagine. And then we go off and we write it, and we get, that goes out to all Thoughtworks to take a look at the write-up, et cetera. And so at the end, we have a very pretty web page and a very pretty PDF. But the truth is, it's, for us at least, several weeks of fairly deep discussions. And there's a deliverable, but it's sort of like, for those of us that have been in consulting for a long time, where we're in there for several weeks, and the deliverable is a 4-page presentation, or a 2-page spreadsheet. People are like, wait, that's all we get? It's like, no, what you got was the 2 months of discussion. It's really important that people don't lose sight of that. They don't just go away in their office and create their radar and then publish it.
Having done this a few times with clients, the Trojan horse idea is true, because it's useful because there is an artifact attached to it. After 2 days, we're going to get this artifact. So there's a clear deliverable attached to it. But the actual value is the conversation. And that's what you see when you act as a facilitator of one of these meetings. About 2 or 3 hours into the meeting, the stakeholder that came to the meeting to make sure everybody's, using their time effectively, you can see the realization wash over their face. It's like, wow, we never have these kind of conversations here, because they're in the category of this call important but not urgent. You have a lot of urgent conversations, but you don't have a lot of these important things that are not urgent, but you really should know. So every developer thinks they know what the head of operations perspective on this particular tool is, except you haven't asked that person. You just think you know until you actually have a conversation about it. That's the real value of this thing. And so when we do it for clients, we recommend, and in fact, one of our largest global clients has been doing this exercise himself once a year, to get people together in the room and have those conversations, because that's the actual secret sauce. And, the icing on the cake is you have an actual physical deliverable that comes out of it. But
So it looks like, from what you both said, right? I think you mentioned ADRs, or architecture decision records. What do you think of using the radar as a governance tool, right? It's not uncommon for clients to actually try and use it that way. Do you endorse that, or do you think that's not a good idea?
Well, not only do I endorse that, I've actually advised several of our large clients to use it that way, because one of the big problems you have in the enterprise architecture realm is visibility in what you're doing, because you're sort of in the strategic stratosphere of the organization, and rank and file developers the only thing they hear from you is no. Oh, can I use this new thing? No, because we haven't standardized. Okay, so you become, the no police, because they have no insight into what you're doing. But there are a lot of things that are like work in progress. And so several of our big, large clients, their enterprise architecture group publishes a radar internally, where all the things that are in SES are the things that we are organizing as we're looking at as an organization. Trial are the things that you should use on your next project, probably, if you want to try something new out. But what this allows you to do, like I said, our radar visualization is basically just an HTML link, an HTTP link. And so behind that, what they do is put things like WIP limits on, okay, we'll let 3 teams experiment with Vue.js. When the 4th one comes in, they can click on it and say, oh no, 3 teams are already using this. We can't do that, but if one of those finishes, maybe we can get in that. And so it gives visibility as an organization. So now developers have sort of an enterprise architecture dashboard. Oh, are we experimenting with this? Let's go see if it's on our internal radar. Really importantly, things that are on hold. Things that are on hold, like I said, are things we're trying to get away from. Don't start anything new and hold. And that's a really valuable tool for enterprise architects to sort of publish internally. Hey, if you're starting a new project, don't start it with this. Use this thing that's an adopt or trial instead. So I think it's a very effective way to make visible the work that enterprise architects are doing on a regular basis that's hard to make visible otherwise, because where's the enterprise architecture dashboard in most organizations? So this is actually sort of a dashboard for that feedback loop.
I think it's also worth mentioning not to hesitate to put things on hold if that's where they belong. And so what I mean by that is quite often there'll be a tool that, well, I like that thing. It works fine for me. Why is it on hold? And it's because we chose a different option. It's not saying that it's a bad thing necessarily. I mean, some bad things and anti-patterns do show up there. But it shouldn't be assumed that something only goes in hold if we have a problem with it. It's just that we think that if you're starting a new project, you should not start it with that.
Well, in fact, you can be much more aggressive on hold in a build your own radar, because it is within a company context. In my opinion, we are way too afraid to put things in hold at Thoughtworks and in Adopt. I think we've gotten way too conservative, in my opinion, as part of this group. I complain about this all the time, but particularly things in hold. The current CTO has to answer for the opinion about that. So
you both talked about hold and you talked about adopt, but there are two other rings as well. Right. So now how do you go about deciding when something goes in hold or adopt? Because like you said, it's a pretty strong statement either way, right? I mean, if you're saying adopt, it means that you're really endorsing a large population to actually take it up. And if you're saying hold, you're saying be very cautious about doing this, or even stop doing it. So how do you decide what goes where?
As a group, I mean, the hold things come up because we have direct project experience. So it's important to remember, as Ken was describing this, the people in the group don't originate the blips. Those are organically filtered up through projects. And so if something on a project comes up on hold, that means that somebody has used it, it promised something, it did not deliver on that promise, and they're mad about it. A lot of enthusiasm usually comes along with hold items because they've been fussing with something that claimed it would do something, and then only to realize, no, they were just lying. No matter how much effort I put into this thing, it doesn't actually do that. It is not uncommon for us to get radars where the same technology will show up in both hold and adopt. Because one team has been using it to spectacular success, and another team has been fussing and fighting with it for some reason. And so in those cases, it usually ends up in trial. So it's very much part of the conversation that we have. But we look at, how egregious is it? And this is another one of those things that we try to avoid just kicking things for the sake of kicking things. We almost there was a pretty strong contingent on the most recent radar meeting to put Microsoft Teams on hold, because it's just objectively terrible compared to a lot of the better alternatives that are out there. And a lot of our teams really do not like using it, but we didn't put it on hold because this is not a decision most teams get to make. This is part of a larger corporate suite. This is not made at the team or the architect level. And so us putting it there is just being ranty about something that is less than optimal, that comes up in a lot of the software development ecosystem. So we try to avoid putting things like that on hold. The other thing that very often comes up, and it ends up getting rejected, in fact, Ken's heard this phrase many times, is stupidity on hold. You can't put stupidity on hold as much as you'd like to. And so things keep coming up that are nominated on teams where objectively, when you look at it from a proper engineering standpoint, no, they're just being stupid. You shouldn't do that. And so we don't put those things on hold either. So that's part of the reason it's pretty nuanced as to hold, because we're not trying to kick things. Like I say, we're almost always trying to be useful and actionable and say, this is on hold because this is the alternative.
But on the practical side too of your question, Prem, is how do you make the decision, regardless of what ring or quadrant we're talking about? The person that comes in with the blip proposal is proposing a specific place on the radar. So they're saying, here is my thing. I'm proposing that it go into trial in techniques. And this is where the strong moderation is important. So they make their little pitch, which again probably came from somebody else, but they're the proxy. The moderator takes a vote right then. And if there's broad agreement, we're done. Move on. If there's broad disagreement, it's also done. It's called. It's gone. If it's split, then you have the discussion about it. But it's very important that moderator keep things moving. I mean, we looked at well over 100 blips. I don't remember how many ended up on volume 31. I think it's 110, 120, something like that. And so from a practical perspective, that's the thing, is you have to have a proposal. You vote about the proposal. You discuss it if required. If there's broad agreement, there's no reason to waste time discussion. If there's broad disagreement, there's no reason to waste time discussion. Now, with that said, at the end of the meeting, there's a concept called a lifeboat and others, where if the person that proposed it, or even somebody else that then fell in love with it or whatever, really feels strongly, we'll go back and revisit. And, so there's this thing that, Neal really loved. Everybody said, nah, that's stupid. And no, he feels strongly about it. So we're not going to do that in the meeting all the time. But at the end, we do give people, so it's not just gone forever, is I guess the point. It requires strong moderation to decide where it goes. But you don't want to spend more than a few minutes on any one blip, or you'll just rabbit hole.
Yeah. So it reminds me a lot of estimation, exercises, which we do with teams, where a story comes up for estimation or whatever the unit of work is. And then now multiple team members vote on it, and then, or at least put up an estimate. If everybody is in the ballpark, then you just move on, agree. And then if you have a conversation, which I think is the more important part of this, when people do disagree, and that's similar in this case as well, looks like.
Well, in fact, Rebecca Parsons came up with most of these moderation techniques over the course of years of moderating these things. And we have some very useful semaphores that we use, particularly when we're in person. So it's a group of 25 or 30 people in person, and everyone is issued during the meeting 3 index cards, a green one, a red one, and a yellow one. And if a topic comes up and everybody agrees or you disagree, you hold up a card for the initial vote. If it's all green, then it's on. If it's all red, it's off. Yellow means I want to discuss it. And yellow can come up at any time. A single yellow card means I want to discuss it more. And so we use a similar kind of mechanism when we do it online, using Zoom and a shared spreadsheet and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. But to Kim's point, that greatly eases the friction of when we're all in agreement or all in disagreement. And we also have a category called too complex to blip. So we painfully realize that we have a paragraph, a few sentences to capture something on our radar. And some techniques are just nuanced. And one of the inevitable destination of some of the very interesting things that get nominated on our radar is the graveyard that we call too complex to blip, because there's just too much nuance to be able to cram into a single blip. And so a lot of discussion ends up, because the moderator doesn't want to spend the entire session talking about that, which we could. Okay, let's move on. It's too complex to blip. Let's move it on and move it to the next, either an article or a podcast or some other destination. The radar is not a universal place for ideas. There's a very specific kind of context that it can go in, and lots of things get nominated. They're just outside that context and cannot make it for that reason. Yeah,
it looks like we don't see the honorable mentions list. That unfortunately is private to the tab group that meets. So it looks like this is a fairly elaborate process, Neal and Ken. Any interesting stories that you have to share with the audience?
I did a conference talk on building your own radar for a while, and what I realized was, as much as we have this sort of scaffolding around this radar idea, it's really just a way of organizing a kind of a disparate space of where something is, and it's true to the radar metaphor, where something's moving towards you or something's moving away from you. So that's kind of the core idea of the radar. So as we mentioned, I've seen this used as an enterprise architecture tool, as a way of visualizing sort of a dashboard of what we're thinking strategically as a direction. But I've also, and this is actually part of the Build Your Own Technology Radar article that I wrote, I've seen some developers use this as a sort of personal career guidance tool. I mean, it's a open source framework, and things that are in adopt are things that you should absolutely be doing. Trial are the things, the directions you should be going in. And things that are in hold are things you should start spending less time on. So the recommendation here is that, so one of the things you should always do as a technologist is keep track of what's coming up in terms of technology. And it's very easy to accidentally end up in technology bubbles. And the problem with being inside a technology bubble is when the bubble starts collapsing, it's hard to tell from the inside because it still just looks like a dome from the inside. You can't tell the dome's getting smaller until it snaps and it goes away. I understood this at a really bad level because one of my first jobs was a company that did consulting and training in this technology called Clipper. Nobody listening to this is going to be old enough to remember Clipper, I suspect, which is this DOS-based tool. And we were great. We had consulting work and training work, and that was fantastic until the day it wasn't. Because it didn't move to Windows, and Windows came and took over the world, and then suddenly we had to scramble because we didn't see the bubble that we were within collapsing. And this is a danger for technologists. You're in a technology bubble. Nobody inside the bubble is going to tell you that it's collapsing. You have to pay attention to that. So that means you need to be strategic about your career. But you also need, this other life, the family life and the life outside the career. So you need to be as efficient as possible about that. So the recommendation is take once a year, twice a year, and sit down and actively think about what should I be moving more toward? What should I be moving more away from? Which is, some sort of beloved thing, but I need to broaden myself. So I did this exercise when we first started talking about the radar build your own radar business. And it made me realize that, so I was trying to move more into general architecture, and I was spending a lot of time on Java language stuff, Java forums and other places where I felt comfortable and had friends, and not enough time on .NET and Python sites. I needed more perspective on those. And so doing this radar exercise forced me to reallocate my time to broaden what I was looking at. And so it's a way of sort of organizing your thoughts and your career directions in sort of a loose scaffolding to make sure you don't get accidentally blindsided by collapsing bubbles.
Yeah, this is probably a good time we've hinted at this throughout, but I do want to be explicit about it. Like in a case like what Neal just talked about, it's probably a living document. It's getting updated, et cetera. Ours, if you look at it online, is a spot in time or a point in time. So just understand that. Like if you're looking at ours and you look up a blip and it says, hey, this went into adopt in 2017, and so they must still be using it. That's not the case. I mean, it might be, but that was the truth at that point in 2017. If things haven't changed for a while, they'll fade from the radar. They'll go away unless there's a compelling reason to re-blip it and move it. It probably isn't coming back. So understand that when you look at ours and you see things, you're like, wait, there's only 5 things in adopt. There's only 5 things you work with. It's like, no, there's only 5 things that moved to adopt in the last 2 issues or what have you. So just something to keep in mind.
Or you do an organic search for Angular and it shows up in adopt and you don't realize it was an adopt in 2018.
Exactly.
And maybe not being adopt now. So one of my longstanding requests, but that our digital team's too busy to work on, is to degrade the visual image of older blips and make them look like they're old typewritten images or something. The older it is, the more degraded the image is. So it looks like it's written on an old scroll or something, just to let you know that, hey, this is a blip, but it's old. So some way of degrading it to, some visual cue. But obviously other things have been higher priority than that.
So I want to be able to time travel So I want to be able to go from current edition to the previous one to the next and the previous and so on and so forth, and see these these blips, fade away, become more prominent and that kind of animation. But yeah, I guess I'll have to wait, or maybe build my own version of the radar.
So if you look on the request list, the backlog of requests on Radar, I think what you just described is number 3 on that backlog. So we used to actually, many years ago, when it was a static publication before it became a website, we used to have a little visualization that showed where it moved from the last Radar to this one, this little ghost thing. But it got really cluttered. And so I think that but I was, as soon as Ajax came out, I thought a perfect use of Ajax, if anybody remembers Ajax as a technology, would be to create a slider on the thing and let you slide backwards and forwards and see the blips move. So,
yeah. So thank you very much, folks. Any parting thoughts before we call it a day?
I would recommend looking at using it. I mean, it's an open source tool. Our recommendation when we do it for clients, because it's not a complicated process, is even if we facilitate the first one, you don't need us for subsequent facilitations because you see how it works. I mean, the main thing you need is what Ken said, is a strong facilitator. So you can do this yourself, and we really strongly recommend that you do this because, yeah, you get a shiny artifact, but what you really get are the conversation that you never have. And that's the thing that is really valuable. Like so many things in software, and a lot of things in agile software development, it's really just ways of tricking people into having actual conversations with each other and spreading information that way. And that's exactly what this is.
Anything from you, Ken?
No, I mean, Neal summed it up. I guess just, spoiler alert, when this podcast comes out, watch for volume 31 and follow in by a week or two and let us know what you think.
Absolutely. So yeah, I just checked. Ajax has never figured in the Thoughtworks Radar, unfortunately. But yeah, maybe it might still do, so. All right, folks, that's all we have for this week. We will see you next time and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Prem.
Thank you.